Welcome back, everyone, to A Foggy Day on Olympus, a place for grown-up discussions aimed at grown-up people, where we consider issues of history, religion, and culture, and why they matter. My name is Coel Campo.
And my name's Mike Pierce, and today, in our series on great 20th century writers, Too Little Red in the Anglosphere, we're looking at an absolutely classic Italian novel, The Leopard by Giuseppe di Lampedusa.
And although we'd already decided to do this episode, we found out recently that it's currently being put out as a new series on Netflix.
Yes, have you seen it? Any of it?
No, I haven't got the chance to check it out yet. I'm assuming that you yourself haven't mastered the technology.
Correct. I thought that Netflix was a sort of breakfast cereal.
Maybe in the next century.
Yes. I'll try and remember it. Okay, so here we've got our man Giuseppe Tomasi di Lampedusa. He's descended from a family of Sicilian nobility, and he was proficient in multiple languages and vastly well-read in European literature.
Yeah, but despite all of these advantages, he mostly lived a pretty dull life, and this was almost the only writing of any significance that he ever produced, right?
Yeah, that's true.
It sounds like maybe he was suffering from Pierce syndrome.
Yeah, he can't have been. He didn't have the advantage of having a pretty girl who refused to get off his case.
Advantage, you say?
Well, yeah. Disadvantage. All right.
Right.
Well, he was born in Palermo, which is the capital of Sicily, and his family owned 2 palaces. And formerly, his title was Prince of Lampedusa, which is a tiny island. Its current population around 6,000 people, halfway between Malta and North Africa. In fact, it's a lot closer to Tunisia than it is to Sicily.
Right, and he's got the title of prince, but he didn't actually rule anything.
No. There are several countries. Poland is one example, Hungary is another, and Sicily is another. There are probably a few more, but I can't think of them, where a noble title didn't actually mean you were very powerful at all. And certainly he wasn't, although they were obviously a lot better off than most people. And in Italian, even the word palazzo, as you might remember from being in Venice, could mean a house that's pretty grand, but it didn't mean, literally palatial. It didn't have quite the connotations that the word palace would have in English.
Right. So basically a pretty well-to-do family.
A well-to-do family, but very much run down, faded splendor, I think, is the abiding note, not just of him and of his family, but of everything he's going to describe about Sicily and that's in his novel. So the novel, The Leopard, Il Gatto Pardo in Italian, tells the story of Don Fabrizio Corbèra, Prince of Salina, and his family, whose emblem is the leopard during the period of the Risorgimento.
But the title of the novel in Italian doesn't actually mean leopard, does it?
No, it means serval, which I'd never heard of until recently. It's spelled Serval, which is a leopard-like creature, only smaller, basically a fierce cat, living in Africa.
Right, so his palace being smaller than a regular palace, we've got the serval being smaller than an actual leopard.
But I suspect that translating it as leopard into English anyway was probably a smart move, because if they'd called it the serval, everybody would have looked at it and thought, what?
This is true, yes. Anyway, risorgimento, I know you don't even like the term, but you should probably remind us what it means.
Okay, well, the reason I don't like it is because it obviously means resurgence. And I really think that for something to be a resurgence, there should have been at some point a surgence, and there hadn't been. It's the name given to the rising tide of Italian nationalism during the course of the 19th century. And so it wants to depict itself as a resurgence of something that had always been there. But of course, it hadn't been. I mean, most nationalisms tend to do this. They hark back to medieval antecedents or something like that. But it's always misleading, and misleading in a different way in most different cases, but we're not going to go into that. We're not even going to go into the Italian case. All we need to know here is that the Risorgimento is this tide of opinion, particularly amongst middle class types and in cities, and particularly in the north and the more modern parts of Italy, wanting a united Italian state. Yes.
So, we're talking about Sicily, and for the geographically challenged, we have a nice map to remind you where that is.
Yeah, well, ever since Fox News referred in a report to, quote, 4 Mexican countries, I've always known one can never be too careful about these things. Although we're sure that all of our viewers are way, way, way above such imbecility. Okay, so here's Sicily, right in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea.
It sounds like a nice place to take a vacation, but we're going to find out that perhaps not so much.
Well, it's both appealing and at least a little unnerving, perhaps less so nowadays than it used to be, for a certain reason that everybody will immediately leap to because it's the only thing that they think of when you mention the name Sicily, which is the mafia. But maybe just a teeny bit about that at the very end, but otherwise we shall be ignoring it for our purposes. Okay, so the novel begins in May 1860 as Garibaldi's red shirts have landed on the coast of Sicily. And most of the action takes place during the 1860s. But then there's a big leap ahead in the penultimate chapter to 20 years later when the central character, Don Fabrizio, is on his deathbed. And then there's a final chapter, a sort of postscript of events in 1910, where the young people in 1860 are now in their 70s. So kind of wrapping the story up and showing the decline of this princely family.
And if anybody decides to pick up the book and read it after this, it's good to know that not all of the chapters take place chronologically. They actually sort of shift around at different places in time. But I think they tell you what the date is of each chapter, right?
Yeah, you're not left in confusion. Yeah, that's right.
Right.
Yeah, he's not a postmodern in that sense. He's writing in the 1950s. So, yeah.
Right.
So the novel takes place mostly in the western part of Sicily, where de Lampedusa himself lived. In fact, he admitted that Don Fabrizio was, in essence, a thinly fictionalized version of his own great-grandfather.
Right, but the story itself is not a fictionalized version of things that happened in the family.
Not really. De Lampedusa's great-grandfather was pretty much like Fabrizio, but also a bit like the man de Lampedusa himself wished that he could be. Some of the other characters, he admitted to friends, were similar to other family members from his own time. Only the depiction of the attitudes and the social realities of the time are real. So it's set against a genuine historical backdrop and the kind of ways that people thought and behaved and responded to those historical developments. Those certainly are real, yes.
Which he would have been really familiar with, having actually lived there.
Well, yes, and having received a whole load of family law himself, passed down, and he was phenomenally well read in history as well as literature. So, yes. Well, the main characters of the Leopard are Don Fabrizio Corbèra, who's Prince of Salina and was born in 1810. So as the novel opens, he's 50 and he's got grown up or nearly grown up children. And his wife, Maria Stella, to whom he has not always been faithful. Their children, there are 7 of them, but the ones that we might mention here are the heir Francesco and daughters Carolina and Concetta. One of the other most important characters is Tancredi, Fabrizio's nephew. There's Father Pirone, the family priest, who's a Jesuit, and Don Fabrizio's confessor, although Don Fabrizio is not a particularly religious man. There's Calogero Sedara, mayor of Donofugata, which is a little place somewhere away from Palermo, and he's a wealthy social upstart. And he's depicted very unfavorably that he's become as rich as the prince himself. And he has a beautiful daughter, Angelica, who ends up marrying Fabrizio's nephew, Tancredi. And the effect of this is to make her and Tancredi effectively the heirs to the family fortune, such as it is. And then there is Emone Chevali, who is an official sent by the new government in Piedmont in northern Italy. Now, if the politics of some of the last couple of slides have passed people by, we are about to explain.
Thank goodness.
Right. So here is Italy in 1829, so 31 years before our story starts, and it consists of multiple states, with Sicily part of the so-called Kingdom of Two Sicilies, governed from Naples on the mainland.
Okay, so at this point, Italy is basically a geographical expression, kind of like Scandinavia now. And it hadn't been under a single ruler since the Ostrogoths in the 6th century, right?
Right. So it had always been a whole bunch of little states, really, yes.
Right. And we should probably talk about all that yellow bit up in the northeast.
Right. Well, that is not a state unto itself. As you can see, it runs over off the map there. It is part of the Austrian Empire. And it includes Venice, had done since the Napoleonic Wars, when Venice had been overrun by Napoleon, but it ended up, along with all Venice's possessions down the Adriatic, under Austrian control.
Right. Okay, and now that central belt in purple is the Papal States.
Right. The papacy ruled central Italy like a secular kingdom and had done since the 8th century. It hadn't always been exactly the same size as it is there in 1829, but those broad features, yes. And that was coming under severe strain. It already had done during the Napoleonic Wars and had been reconstituted after those were all over.
And we discuss much more about the Papal States in episode 1 of our series on the agony of the Catholic Church.
Yes, you can see much more of that there. Okay, well, a little bit here about Sicily and how cruel beauty had shaped the way that Sicilians themselves thought. This is from the novel, The Leopard. Violence of landscape, this cruelty of climate, this continual tension in everything, and these monuments even of the past, magnificent, yet incomprehensible because not built by us, and yet standing around like lovely mute ghosts. All those rulers who landed by main force from every direction, who were at once obeyed, soon detested, and always misunderstood. Their only expressions, works of art we couldn't understand, and taxes which we understood only too well, and which they spent elsewhere. All these things have formed our character, which is thus conditioned by events outside our control, as well as by a terrifying insularity of mind.
Okay, so first things first. Obviously, he's a wonderful writer.
Right.
But this is a really long sentence, if you're honest.
It is, yes. Yes. I'm quite proud of myself for pacing it in a way that people could stay with it.
Right. You did marvelously.
Great. That's the first nice thing you've said to me since ever, really. Anyway,
Yeah. So in this quote here, he mentions a bunch of different rulers who landed by main force from every direction, he says. And this reflects all the very different rulers that the island has had, but over more than 2,000 years.
yep, Greeks from around 750 BC, but also Carthaginians on the western side from around 600 BC. They fought the Greeks. Romans from the late 3rd century BC. And then as the Western Empire is collapsing, there's maybe 3 generations of Germanic barbarians, Vandals, and then Ostrogoths from 469 to 535. And then the Byzantines take over, Justinian's reconquests of as much of the West as he can manage, if you remember, from 535, and that lasts until 827. And then the Arabs take over until the 11th century. And then the Normans in the 11th and 12th centuries, and then the Hohenstaufen, then the French, then Spanish rulers, right down to the 19th century. And those last 2 lines, all those things have formed our character, which is conditioned by events outside our control, as well as by a terrifying insularity of mind. Now, no pre-modern people had much control over their own lives. But in the case of Sicily, this was particularly extreme and exacerbated by being an island, in fact, and insular in outlook. So they're geographically an island, but also their outlook is very, very insular.
The reason that it changed hands so many times is because it's kind of centrally located here in the Mediterranean, and throughout history there's just a lot of different forces moving back and forth in this area.
Right. And given where it is, frankly, it's amazing that anybody hung on to it for more than a couple of generations. Some of those things that I
Right.
mentioned there, those periods of rule, lasted quite a few centuries, which is an achievement in itself, given where it is. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, but also it's a place of desperate poverty. So here's another one of these descriptions. In the livid light of 5:30 in the morning, Donna Fugata was deserted and apparently despairing. In front of every house, the refuse of squalid meals accumulated along leprous walls. Trembling dogs were routing about with a greed that was always disappointed. An occasional door was already open, and the smell of sleep spread out into the street. By glimmering wicks, mothers scrutinized the eyelids of their children for trachoma. Almost all were in mourning, and many had been the wives of those carcasses one stumbles over on the turns of mountain tracks. The men were coming out, gripping their hoes to look for someone who might give them work, God willing. Subdued silence alternated with exasperated screams of hysterical voices. Away over toward the convent of the Holy Spirit, a tin-coloured dawn was beginning to tinge leaden clouds.
This is a pretty grim passage, but all I could all I could think about was if
You are
if you didn't
heartless, Matt,
frighten
and I always knew it.
yeah, well, that's probably true.
Yes.
But I was thinking if you didn't frighten children so badly, you'd be a great person to read books to them at the library.
Well, I must have terrified my own children because I spent so long reading stories to them when they were little. And not just when they were like, 2, 3, 4, 5. This carried on till, well, at least till the eldest was about 12. Even though obviously he was reading for himself, we did all of the classic books and me putting on all the silly voices from Robert Louis Stevenson novels, or I actually read them Dickens's Oliver Twist. It took us about 3 months. But we did it. Yeah, so I've got previous, as the cops say.
Right, right. Well, your kids turned out okay, so maybe it would be a good idea after all.
Okay, yes, I suppose, yes, at least they haven't been discovered yet.
Right. Yeah. Anyways, so in this rather grim passage, he's talking about squalid houses and children ridden with disease. He says many menfolk are killed in the fighting, and the others are day laborers that are not really knowing if they're going to have work from one day to the next.
Right, that last bit there is like something out of the Gospels, isn't it? All the men hanging around to see if they're going to be hired that day. And here we are in the 19th century, and it's still happening
Right.
around the coasts of the Mediterranean. Yes, absolutely. Okay, well, by early May 1860, so just a few days before our novel opens, most of northern Italy had already been united in the kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia. They had already mopped up most of the small states, and there are the three big lumps left, right? There is the Austrian territory, which they haven't got yet. The Veneto and around there in the northeast is still in Austrian hands. There are the Papal States, which are militarily puny, but diplomatically a bit difficult simply to trash in, but they do it in the end. And there's the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. So the Kingdom of Piedmont Sardinia is under its king Victor Emmanuel and his chief minister Count Camillo Cavour, who is the brains behind this whole program.
Right. And so this is right at the point where the novel begins. So basically, the country that the characters of the novel are inhabiting is about to disappear, and it's going to be invaded by the Northerners who are trying to bring about this unification of Italy.
Right. And the Northerners are richer, they are more modern, they have some industry, and they have very different sensibilities. From the Sicilian point of view, they all look practically like Germans to them in the way that they think and operate, right?
Right. So a culture clash is about to happen.
Yeah, and old ways of life are about to disappear, at least partly.
Right. Right. And
So,
they're all supposed to get along and be chummy in this
oh, well, of course, because they're all
this
Italians together.
right.
Oh,
Right.
I could go on for so long about the total fallacy of nationalist rhetoric, not just in respect of Italy, of anywhere. But anyway, there we are. So Garibaldi's nationalist troops overthrow Sicily in 1860, and the new Kingdom of Italy under Victor Emmanuel is proclaimed in 1861. By 1866, the situation looks like this.
So half of the papal states have been swallowed up by the new Italy, and half of them haven't. So where was the capital at this point? I mean, it's clearly not in Rome.
Right. Well, in 1861, it was Turin, Torino in Italian, and I also think in American. Americans say Torino, they don't say Turin, do they? She doesn't
I'm not
know.
really sure, to be honest.
That one surprised me. Anyway, okay. In 1865, it moved to Florence, and Rome became the capital only in 1871, after the other half of the Papal States had fallen.
Right, and that is a story that we tell in episode 2 of our series on the agony of the Catholic Church.
Yeah, you really need to see that series, people.
We spent an agonizing amount of time over it, so you might as well.
Oh, is that the best you can do? Right.
I know it wasn't very good.
Oh. Okay, so here is the nationalists' military hero, Giuseppe Garibaldi, the archetypal nationalist guerrilla fighter.
I just know that you have a comment you want to make about his outfit.
Yeah, it's such a pose. This is basically the mid 19th century version of teenagers going around in grenade shredded jeans. Wanting to be poor and one of the people, apart from the actual poverty bit. So he's going around,
Right.
Peasant garb kind of thing. Yeah, it's pure affectation. And he and King Victor Emmanuel mutually detested one another, but they found an alliance distasteful but necessary.
And what was the reason that he and the king detested one another?
Well, the nationalists didn't really want the new Italy to be a monarchy at all. But they simply didn't have the political strength. They certainly didn't have any military at their disposal other than him and his band of revolutionaries to bring that about. They needed some military muscle. And if they tried to take on and say, fight the kingdom of Piedmont as well, I mean, they would have been defeated within 10 minutes. They could take on a ramshackle place like the Two Sicilies, but not a proper army. So they did need the king. The king, on the other hand, despised the nationalists. He wasn't particularly interested in a united Italy. His chief minister, Count Cavour, may have been, but he was interested in having a larger kingdom. The same dynamic is
Right.
playing out in Germany, by the way, with the German nationalists and the King of Prussia. I mean, they detested one another, but they found one another mutually useful, right? So the advantage for the king was that he could be a lot less absolute. He could be reduced to being a constitutional monarch with a lot less power of a much larger kingdom. So if he gave up some degree of power, he would gain in terms of territory. The nationalists wouldn't quite have the republic that they wanted, but they would have a united Italy. And as I say, something similar was going on in Germany. We can't pursue that one here. That was what was happening.
Right.
Okay, well, back to conditions in Sicily then. And here we've got part of a conversation between Don Fabrizio and Chevali, this northerner sent down to help manage the transition. And Don Fabrizio is very frank with this newcomer because he thinks this guy is actually okay. So he explains to him, and thereby to us, the readers, why the Sicilians are the way that they are. He says that the northerners were enraptured by the view, by the vehemence of the light, but they confessed that they'd been petrified by observing the squalor, the antiquity, the filth of the access roads. I did not explain to them that one thing had derived from the other, as I tried to do to you.
So Fabrizio's explaining that the rugged landscape and the vehemence of the light, or in other words, the heat, is what led to the squalor and the poverty.
Yeah, the two things are connected. One of them then asked me what those Italian volunteers were really coming to do here in Sicily. They're coming to teach us good manners, I replied, but won't succeed because we are gods. I don't think they understood, but they laughed and went off.
So, what does he mean by we are gods here?
Well, this is his joking way of saying that Sicilians think themselves to be absolutely perfect. They don't need anything from outside. He's about to expatiate on that a whole load more. But that's his opening salvo in pointing out the way that Sicilians think of themselves. They are very haughty, even though they know themselves really to be absolutely wretched.
Right.
Okay, that is my answer to you too, my dear Chevalier. The Sicilians will never want to improve, for the simple reason that they believe they are perfect. Their vanity is stronger than their misery. Now, that sentence there is probably the most quoted in the whole book, I think. Any interference by strangers, which is what the Northerners are, whether by origin or even if they are Sicilians by independence of spirit, upsets their ravings of achieved completeness, risks disturbing their complacent expectation of nothingness. Trampled by a dozen different peoples, they believe they have an imperial past that gives them the right to sumptuous funerals. Because, of course, they've been part of all these empires over centuries. And so they have this composite civilization. So they think themselves wonderful. But they don't actually want to do anything with it. They just want a sumptuous funeral.
Right.
These are things one can't say to a Sicilian. And if you'd said them yourself, I too would have objected.
Yeah, so this is a confessional. He's flattering Chevalier by admitting these things to an outsider.
Yes, he is. And of course, de Lampedusa is using it as a means of explaining the Sicilians to us. But he's making the point that even he, Don Fabrizio, the central character here, who is saying all of these things, if an outsider had said it, he would have denied it, even though he himself knew it to be true. And in a way, that's his point. Sicily wanted to sleep despite their invocations. Why should it listen to them, the northerners who'd come to put them all straight? If it is rich, if it is wise, if it is honest, if it is admired and envied by all, if it is perfect, in a word.
This sounds like some parts of the Arab world in more recent times.
Yes, not all of it, of course, but some parts. Really well aware that much of the rest of the world, particularly the West, is much richer, much more powerful, but nevertheless wanted to look down upon it as a bunch of barbarians, with some reason, but we talked about that at length in another series, but nevertheless aware of the fact that internally, domestically, in their own personal lives, in their homes, life is really grim. So there's this kind of sharp division between the face that one presents to the outside world and the knowledge that one has about one's actual circumstance. Yes. Now, even here they are saying that the fault for the bad state of things here and elsewhere is feudalism, mine, so to speak, because he's Don Fabrizio, he's the Prince of Salina, he is, if you like, a feudal lord. But feudalism has been everywhere, foreign invasions too. The results, meanwhile, are different. In other words, everybody's been through feudalism, right? And loads of other places have been through modernization, and it works out a lot better. How come we're so bad? The reason for the diversity must be found in that sense of superiority that dazzles in every Sicilian eye, which we ourselves call pride, which in reality is blindness.
One can see why many Sicilians were kind of appalled by this novel.
Yeah, not because it wasn't true, but because it was. And because de Lampedusa, as a well-placed native, knew it better than anyone.
Right, right.
Okay, well, to finish this part of things, so in Sicily, it doesn't matter whether things are done well or done badly. The sin which we Sicilians never forgive is simply that of doing at all. We are old, Chevalier, very old. For more than 25 centuries, we've been bearing the weight of a superb and heterogeneous civilization, all from outside, none made by ourselves, none that we could call our own. We're as white as you are, Chevalier, and as the Queen of England, and yet for 2,500 years we've been a colony. I don't say that in complaint, it's our fault. But even so, we're worn out and exhausted. Sleep, my dear Chevalier, sleep. That is what Sicilians want, and they will always hate anyone who tries to wake them, even in order to bring them the most wonderful of gifts. And I must say, between ourselves, I have strong doubts whether the new kingdom of Italy, will have many gifts for us in its baggage.
Yeah, and he was probably right about that.
Yeah.
So this passage is kind of hitting on that note of lethargy.
Yeah, and it marked de Lampedusa's own life. He's describing himself along with it here. His life for many years, he didn't do much with it, but read and go to the theatre. More about that in a moment. But there's also, I would want to interpose here, I think there is an element of self-deception. He keeps talking about an us and these outside rulers. But of course, the reality is that Sicilians themselves were made up of these people who had come over so many centuries. So to think of another example, perhaps more familiar to a number of our readers, the Normans invading England were not simply people who came and then somehow disappeared. They were absorbed into the stock of the population, and you can see that in a number of the names and the language and so on. Okay, well, Sicily has had even more of that than England has. England's a relatively simple case. So they are a complete ethnic admixture. Loads of people's names and of place names, if you do the etymology on them, they actually come from Arabic. Right, so they're a whole mixture of Greeks and Carthaginians and people from mainland Italy and Germanic tribes and
Right.
Arabs and Normans. They're all in there, right? But still, he's wanting to do what most people unreflectively want to do and talk about the people in their area or country, or in this case, island, as a collective us. Well, they are a collective us, but they are an amalgam of all of these elements.
Right.
So that's the thing that I think he's avoiding there.
Yeah. So what you're saying is that the United States was not the first melting pot to ever exist.
Sorry, I thought you were going to do a Kathy Newman on there when you started your question with those dread words, but oh dear. Yes, I guess so. Yes. But most people have become this way without conscious intention. Well, maybe that's true of
Right.
America as well, but like a load of developments that get firmly entrenched, people then elevate it to the level of principle and then pat themselves on the back and tell themselves what fine fellows they are.
Right. Right. This is what's so great about his novel, though. It's like he knows exactly that things are the way that they are, and he puts his finger on it, but he's displaying this way of life that he's a part of.
Yes. And there's a chapter later on, I forget which one now, which, if the younger Pierce had ever read this, would simply have skipped because it's all dense description. But I decided to persevere. Now, particularly at the great age that I'm now at, I thought, no, come on, you've got to do this. So I did. And I was really glad. And it's where Tancredi and Angelica, these young lovers, are going through uninhabited parts of the great house. And they come across all these paintings and ancient works of art and bits left over from churches and stuff like this. And of course, the point of all these descriptions is to show you it's almost like the artistic equivalent of a luxurious jungle and overgrowth, or portraying Sicily's complex past, which is simultaneously fascinating and beautiful, but also decaying. And it's all just
Right.
so brilliantly done. Yeah.
As a young person reading this novel, when I got to this chapter, I was thinking to myself, oh, yes, the young couple in secluded parts of the house. Now we're finally going to get into some of the romance. And we did not.
No. He spared us anything too graphic. Well, I felt I had to include some of the absolute killer lines in the book. These are taken out of context here, but it doesn't matter. They're just wonderful phrases. He talks about being old and uselessly wise.
Well, this sounds like you, doesn't it? Except for maybe the wise part.
Yeah, very nice. Thank you. Well, but there's a lot of truth in that when you get to be old, you've got all this accumulated wisdom and very few venues in which you can actually let it out. And also you find that loads of people are not really very much inclined to listen to you. And so it all kind of goes to waste. And that's one of the things that people don't want to admit. Yeah.
Right. Why not start a podcast then?
Well, it's not a podcast. Yeah. Not that I'm getting much chance to give out any wisdom here. I keep being interrupted by somebody or other mocking me. Well, here's one for the young people then. Flames for a year, ashes for 30 was the description of how Tancredi and Angelica's marriage turned out. Oh dear.
Yeah, that's a bit of a gut punch, isn't it?
Yeah, it is really. Yeah. Right. And then this description of Calogero Sedara, the upstart, wealthy guy who's Angelica's father. And he's described here brilliantly. It is deliciously poisonous. Free as he was from the shackles imposed on many other men by honesty, decency, and plain good manners, he moved through the jungle of life with the confidence of an elephant, which advances in a straight line, rooting up trees and trampling down layers without even noticing scratches of thorns and moans from the crushed. Yes.
That's pretty good writing.
Yeah, yeah. Well, while there's death, there's hope.
Now, this sounds like something you'd say.
Yes, maybe. But he's actually describing here the Sicilian mentality in general, that they actually long for oblivion. And then there's what Fabrizio says when he is offered a position in the Senate of the new Kingdom of Italy and he declines it. He says, I am without illusions. What would the Senate do with me, an inexperienced legislator who lacks the faculty of self-deception, essential requisite for wanting to guide others? This crushing put down of these northerners who are so naively certain they got the solution to everybody's problems. And he's saying, I don't
Right.
have that, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
And then a past that attracts us only because it is dead. So if Lampedusa had no illusions about modernity, he had none about an idealized past either, which is good.
Right. Yeah, but the trouble with that is all you're really left with is apathy.
Which is what de Lampedusa suffered from and his characters suffer from. And he tells us that Sicilians generally suffer from a sense of hopelessness.
They should have put Nietzsche as the spirit animal on the cover of the book.
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure he would have had that much in common with these people, except that. You're right about that. Yes,
Right.
for sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, well, so this best-selling novel is made into a film in 1963 with Burt Lancaster seated there in the centre as Don Fabrizio and Alain Delon as his nephew Tancredi and Claudia Cardinale as Tancredi's low-born but beautiful wife, Angelica.
Is this an Italian film or
Yes.
is this a product of Hollywood?
Well, it's in Italian, but you can see it with subtitles, and it won a whole load of prizes. So, yes. But the same thing is true of the Netflix production, actually, also in Italian with subtitles. Okay, but we haven't actually said a lot about our author, so we should say a little bit about his life here, I think. So he's born in 1896, dies in 1957. He's born in Palermo. Effectively, he's an only child because his sister died in 1897 when Giuseppe was just one. His education was good, but very erratic. So he learned to speak fluent French at a very young age, and he had, Greek and Latin, but he was educated more at home. As a young adult, he went to university, but he didn't complete the course, and everything was kind of chopped and changed constantly. But nevertheless, in his case, he did glean an awful lot. He served in the Italian army from 1915 to 20. Now, Italy entered World War I only in 1915. After the war broke out, the Italians weren't sure if they were going to join it. And then there was a debate about whether they did, which side they would be on. And then those pesky British promised them loads of territory down the eastern Adriatic if they would join in, most of which they never got. So they came in on the side of the British and French. He never saw military action, but he was captured by Austro-Hungarian forces after the disastrous Battle of Caporetto in 1917.
Right, because Italian forces didn't do very well in World War One, did they?
No, they didn't do very well in World War II either. Relatively speaking, probably better in World War One. But actually, Italian forces have never done very well. They've just been fortunate in a number of their conflicts in the 19th century and also in World War One to be on the winning side, so they gained territory anyway. But they didn't tend to win many victories themselves. But the Battle of Caporetto was particularly disastrous, and the Austro-Hungarian forces broke right through, way to the Italian rear. And so de Lampedusa was scooped up as a prisoner in that lot. And he was then in a prisoner of war camp outside Vienna until the end of the war when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed. And so they quote, escaped, which was laughably easy at that point, and just walked home, he and a whole load of others. Yeah. But then he stayed in the army for a couple of years afterwards until 1920. Okay, so we've said he learned to speak French very early, but he also spoke German, English, and later on Spanish, as well as some Russian, and he'd picked up Latin and Greek in school as well. So he's very accomplished in that area. And in 1932, when he would have been 36, he got married to Alexandra von Wolff-Stormesee, who was half Italian, half Baltic German. And she was a psychoanalyst. They didn't have any children.
Now, his wife and his mother didn't really get along at all, did they?
No. Well, his mother was very, very domineering, I suppose. He had a very close relationship with her. Maybe that's because he was an only child, effectively. And they didn't get on at all. No, but although it's very difficult even for people who are alive now, to see inside their private lives, and these people are now long dead, I think, to me, it's fairly clear that although his wife, well, she certainly wouldn't have been my choice, but nevertheless, I think it was mother's fault. He was so worried about getting married at all, he didn't even dare tell his mother. And he was away from home at the time. He got married quietly and then wrote a letter home saying that he was now engaged to be married, even though he was already married. And by the time they got home, the two women got on so badly that his wife left and lived elsewhere, and he stayed home with mother. And they didn't actually permanently live together until his mother had died. So, yeah, I think we can see what the central problem was there. Yeah.
Right. A few people on the internet would call that some red flags.
Oh, yes. I suppose we're into red flags these days, aren't we? Yeah. But also, it's quite noticeable that she's a psychoanalyst. I mean, this is a brand new line of study and of work, if you will, got going by Sigmund Freud just at the start of the 20th century. Okay, so his family's palace in Palermo was destroyed by Allied bombing during the war, and after that they lived in an apartment. He was able to rescue his furniture and most of his books, but yeah, they lived in an apartment for the rest of their lives. And he wrote some essays of literary criticism and some short stories, but The Leopard is his only novel, and that wasn't published until 1958, the year after his death. He didn't even start writing it till 1955.
Wow. So he never even lived to see The Leopard's publication, let alone its massive success.
Right. No, he didn't.
So why did the novel upset so many people? I mean, did it have something to do with his politics?
Yeah, well, his politics are a little hard to pin down. Let's say a little bit about those first. He's certainly not a man of the left, but he's not really a person of the right either. He said he was a monarchist, but he admired the Puritans of the English Civil War period and the creation of the English Republic. He admired a lot of things about Britain, actually, and spent a reasonable amount of time there, or at least visited quite often. He mildly approved of Mussolini's government at first, after Mussolini seized power in 1922, but rapidly went off it and was not very supportive at all. Yeah, his novel upset the left because it was concerned with the princely family and it was obviously somewhat sympathetic to it. But it upset nationalist opinion because obviously it's showing that the myths that have been strung around nationalist Italy were simply not true, right? That the South experienced what happened as an invasion. And it's often been pointed out by various historians that by the time the state of Italy was created, only about 10% of the population spoke what was then going to be defined as standard Italian, Tuscan. And so they had to learn it. So, yeah, all of this, the novel pushed back on all of these things. So the left didn't like it, the right didn't like it, the public loved it. which is great.
It sounds like the same strategy that we're trying to employ here. If you just offend everybody
Well, yes, it's
equally.
equal opportunities offence. It is like my classes in college. But yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, fairly recently, I worked my way through David Gilmour's biography of de Lampedusa called The Last Leopard. It's rarely a riveting read, but that's not his fault. De Lampedusa's life was only occasionally exciting, say around the time of his military service and so on. But much more often, it was really rather dull.
So you're saying that we shouldn't buy this book?
Yeah. I think if you find a copy lying around, by all means dive into it, because David Gilmour is brilliant, and I wouldn't want this fact to reflect badly on him. I think he did the very best that could be done with absolutely terrible materials to work with. I mean, sometimes he's saying some interesting stuff about de Lampedusa's life and so on, but he does so very little. He doesn't even have a job, really, for most of his life. And later on, he decides to give some literature classes and throws himself into that with some kind of vigor, but as a sort of private tutor. He's not employed by a school or anything like that. And even that's fairly late on. He just seems to spend his time reading books and going to the theatre. And Gilmour is reduced at some passages to going through his theatre tickets or train tickets to find out what trips he had made and this kind of thing. Oh my goodness, come on. But it really isn't Gilmour's fault, as is demonstrated by, for example, this book here, The Pursuit of Italy. It's a dazzling history of Italy, and it shows what Gilmour can do when he gives himself half a chance. It's almost 500 pages, and it's absolutely ridiculously cheap at $14 or $15 for the paperback. I mean, that is just totally bonkers because that's a large book and it's absolutely fantastic.
I was starting to get seriously worried that we wouldn't have any book recommendations. I mean, what on earth would our poor viewers do with all of their money?
Yeah, we can't do that to them. So this is how to spend your money this week, folks.
Right.
And finally, this is not strictly anything to do with de Lampedusa, but it is to do with Sicily. This is a short classic, only about 160 pages, in Sicily. And Norman Lewis recounts his experiences there from the 1950s to the 1990s, although he was actually part of the British forces, well, with the Anglo-American forces that crossed over from North Africa to Sicily and then to southern Italy in 1943 during World War II. So that was his kind of first contact. But then he got married to a woman from the region and spent a lot more time there and kept going backwards and forwards really for the rest of his life. But it's a beautiful island which, in his estimation, didn't even begin to enter the modern world, despite the unification in Italy, until the Allied landings in 1943. So he felt that what he was finding going there as a soldier was still a pre-modern society, and which, as he points out, so often remains cursed right down to this day by the mafia.
Right. Yeah, we should congratulate ourselves. I mean, we got all the way through this episode without mentioning really the first thing that everyone thinks of when Sicily is mentioned.
This is true. Yes. But I don't know how you feel about The Leopard. I think that it's the best novel that I've ever read. Not that I've read a huge number, you understand. And I think the one we covered last week, The Bridge on the Drina, may be the second best. But I mean,
Right.
would you put it right up there in your estimation? Or you've probably read more novels than I have. But
Yeah, I don't know that any of them are of any substantial value. No, I did think it was really great. Like you said, there were, like we saw in some of these passages, he's obviously, a fantastic writer. And then you've got, just like we mentioned, some really beautiful descriptions of the island itself. So, yeah, I really enjoyed it. I think I probably ought to read it again now that I have a better understanding of what's all of the politics and what's going on, and
Right.
yeah.
And now that the baby's giving you so much more time.
Oh yeah, yeah. I've got plenty of time to relax
Of
now.
course you have.
Okay, so next week we'll be talking about not just one novel, but several, plus some other writings by a very significant German Jewish journalist and author.
Yes, it's Josef Roth, a tragic figure who overthrew his own youthful opinions as a result of the experiences of his tumultuous time, especially the rise of Nazism. So, yeah, next week it's the life and the writings of Josef Roth.
So if you guys enjoyed this video, we do kindly beg you on hands and knees if you would just repost to social media and send it to all of your friends so that we can become rich and famous and retire and move to
Yes,
Sicily. Well,
I'm
maybe
just
not.
enjoying the mental picture of Coel on hands and knees begging people to repost this. But yes, I will
Yeah,
request it, only much more haughtily, of course. But do it,
of
people.
course.
Do it.
Of course.
You know you want it.
Yeah.
Thank you for staying with us, everybody, and we will see you all again next week. Bye bye now.
Bye, everyone.